Welcome to our third of four Google Hangouts on the Colorado Ludlow Massacre, which is sponsored by the Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources program at Metropolitan State University of Denver, History Colorado, the Denver Post Educational Services, and the TPS Teachers Network. I'm Peggy O'Neill-Jones, Director of the Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources program at MSU Denver. In 1914, a 10-day clash between striking members of the United Mine Workers and mine guards employed by the Rockefeller family ended with more than 20 deaths, most of them women and children, as a tent colony in Ludlow, Colorado burned. Strikers responded with guerrilla warfare tactics that killed an additional 30 strikebreakers and guards, destroyed mines, and 2 towns. As with any historic event, museums keep the memory and the lessons learned alive for future generations. A lot goes into choosing resources and primary sources that represent the many sides of the story, the expectations of diverse audiences, and lets the viewers draw their own conclusions about what happened and why, much the same way we want our students to explore historical events. Today we'll explore the Ludlow event from the curator's perspective. Our guests today are Dr. Bill Convery, State Historian and Director of Exhibits and Interpretation at History Colorado in Denver, Colorado, which will present the Children of Ludlow exhibit at the History Colorado's El Pueblo Museum, which is near the historic Ludlow site, and Don DePrince, who's the Director of the El Pueblo Museum in Pueblo, Colorado. So let's get started. First, we'll start with Bill. Bill, let's start out with a short historical background about the Ludlow Massacre and why the 100th anniversary is worth commemorating.
Sure. Hello. Good afternoon. The Great Coal Strike of 1913 and 1914 that culminated in the Ludlow Massacre of April 1914 was really the end result of about 30 years of labor strife in the Rocky Mountains. In the gold and silver mines, and then in the coal mines, miners and smeltermen were engaged in a conflict with mine owners and operators over control of the conditions of the workplace. And for miners in Colorado, mining had become the most dangerous occupation in the nation. And more than 3,000 miners have died in mining accidents in Colorado since the 1880s. And the United Mine Workers began to organize in the southern coal fields of Colorado. They were looking for a number of reforms, including the recognition of the unions as an agent of collective bargaining, the use of union check weighmen to weigh the coal that miners were producing. Miners were paid by the ton for their coal. And there was a particular emphasis on focus on enforcing the mine safety laws of Colorado that were already on the books. There were other issues as well, like an 8-hour day. All of these came together, and by 1913, the United Mine Workers could no longer come to an agreement with the various mine owners of southern Colorado, including the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, the Vicker American Fuel Company, and others. And miners voted to walk out and go on strike in September of 1913. Most of the miners lived in company towns, and so when they went on strike, they were evicted from their homes. The union organized several tent camps on the plains of eastern Colorado, and the strikers moved their families into tent communities in southern Colorado. One of these, the largest of these, was in Ludlow. And the Colorado National Guard was brought down to basically keep the peace, but as time went on, they became more and more the agent of protecting strikebreakers for going into the mines and keeping the mines working. It's created a lot of tension among the union, and as the first set of National Guardsmen rotated out, they were replaced by guardsmen who were very often on the payroll of the mining companies. This incredible conflict of interest created more tension, and by the spring of 1914, tensions had reached a point where a conflict took place. 2013 and 2014 were the centennial of the Great Strike and the Ludlow Massacre, and for a long time now, people at History Colorado and elsewhere were very interested in commemorating the centennial of this. And Don DePrince, who will be speaking in a moment, came up with a really terrific idea for creating an exhibit that focused on the children of Ludlow. because families were involved in the strike, because families were involved in the process of coal mining, children at a very early age went to work in the mines, or their daughters helped raise their families. Children were living in the tent colonies, children were marching on the picket lines, and children were certainly engaged and casualties in the Ludlow Massacre. So by looking at Ludlow, the Great Strike in Ludlow from a children's point of view, we were looking at one of perhaps the greatest stakeholders.
And Bill, Ludlow was controversial in its time. It was labor versus big business, a topic that's controversial now. When you're putting together an exhibit such as the Children of Ludlow, what are the challenges in creating such a controversial exhibit?
Well, I think any civically engaged exhibit that History Colorado or any other institution does has the potential for controversy. And it's incumbent upon museums to be very sensitive to the different points of view, the multiple points of view that took place at the time, and also perhaps surround an event today. We always look at history and we sort of interpret history through the lens of our own current time. And certainly when you look at an event like the Great Strike and the Ludlow Massacre, it raises echoes in contemporary debates about the relationship between labor and management today. Our job is to listen very carefully to those kinds of issues and be sensitive to them as we move forward. It's not necessarily our job to take sides, but although we can, we can draw historical conclusions about the past, but a part of that is that museums such as History Colorado have a responsibility to be balanced in their interpretation, to make sure that they're representing multiple points of view in exhibits such as the Children of Ludlow. I think one of the other really interesting points for the Children of Ludlow is that this is an exhibit that is very much about the community of Pueblo and southern Colorado. And Don and the other exhibit project team, other members of the project team, were very careful to always keep in mind their audience for this exhibit. And their audience is primarily people in the community of Pueblo and in greater southern Colorado. We were telling their story. And so we had to make sure that we did a very good job of being accurate about that. And I think it really speaks well of Don and the project team that they spent a lot of time listening to community members about their interpretations of this story. And Don put together several community history workshops where people would come in and share their family stories about Ludlow with us. And by doing that, she was able to sort of broaden this from a very narrow, well, this is about labor versus management, to this is an event that defined our community. And so it gave it a better grounding, and it anchored it in the community and the sense of self.
Thank you. And Don, and let me ask you, History Colorado is hosting the Children of Ludlow exhibit at the El Pueblo Museum in Justin. What resources did you use, and what questions are you trying to illuminate for your audience?
Well, we used a variety of traditional resources in terms of, we visited the archives, the CFNI archives in our community. We visited with people in our community. As Bill told you, we did some memory writing workshops where we invited people to share their own interpretations of the history of Ludlow. And why this is so important is because oftentimes stories like Ludlow, which tend to be about power or the little people against the power structure, oftentimes are remembered in different ways via, official documentation. So the story's officially documented in one way, and we felt like it was very important that we talked to people who also had important details to the story, because oftentimes their voices were not heard. We heard many times as we worked on this exhibit that this story had been swept under the rug for a century. It wasn't taught in our schools in southern Colorado. It wasn't in textbooks. And so, we had a duty to really talk to the people in our community, because this is really how the history had been preserved. It wasn't always preserved in books the way that other historical stories were. We believe that this story has been passed down from kitchen table to kitchen table, and we would have missed out had we not tapped into that resource. And then this sort of speaks to some of the overarching questions that we had as we put this exhibit together. You know, first of all, there's an urge oftentimes when you're creating a story to simplify that story, and we would have done a serious injustice by trying to simplify this story. It's very complicated. There are multiple perspectives. You know, we've got the company, we've got the National Guard, we have miners, and the miners in the Union aren't always the same, you know, they aren't always the same group. So the Union's another perspective. And then we've got families, which are women and children. This exhibit illuminates the children's perspective, but as we put it together, we wanted to be cognizant of all those many perspectives. You know, we stayed focused on the children's perspective, but we wouldn't have been able to do a good job had we not considered all of the perspectives surrounding this topic. And so, you know, one of my goals was, you know, balance is important, but sometimes there's this sense of false equivalency where you're so eager to create this balanced perspective, you show that there are two sides and those sides are always equal. And history is much more complicated than that. I hoped personally that people would go into this exhibit and come out feeling more complicated about the topic of Ludlow. That you know, they might have gone in with one single narrative, but when they left, they would feel much more complicated about it. And so that's one of the questions I had. I think, you know, another question I had, and this has sort of evolved as putting the exhibit together, but also evolved as we've done this statewide commemoration, which is who has the right to remember? You know, we're talking here about primary sources, and so oftentimes when we think about primary sources, we think about newspapers or documents that you might find in archives. Well, those are often compiled. Those are documents written by official people. You know, whether it be a journalist or whether it be a coroner. Those are official documents, but there's this whole other realm of memory that we need to remember, and that is, you know, people's memories and the memories that have been passed down from eyewitness to granddaughter and then generations beyond that. And so while we all believe and know that memory is faulty, especially stories that have been passed down, I think it's important to always ask the question, who has the right to remember this? Is it only these official documents that we give credence to when we think about history, or what kind of privilege do we give to people's family stories as well?
I like that. Who has the right to remember? There are a couple of questions in from our audience, and let me ask either Bill or Don, you can take the question. In addition to working with the community, how did you purposefully work with the local media to report on all your outreach efforts? And that question is from Mary Johnson.
I can probably answer that. We worked, our local newspaper doesn't always enjoy the story of Ludlow. They are not proud of this moment in our local history. But we had a very fortunate coincidence in that the editor of our paper was doing a weekly column on 100 years ago. So 100 years ago, 1913, this week in 1913. And he was very engaged in the overall story of Ludlow. And for that reason, he followed every single event we had in southern Colorado very closely in a way that was good for the exhibit. And so, you know, I want to say we did some magical something to engage the local press, but I think it was the story in and of itself that engaged them.
Yeah, and if I may add to that, at the same time this was going on, there was a statewide organization, a statewide Ludlow Centennial Commemorative Commission that was trying to serve as a clearinghouse for programs and activities around the state, and it was certainly involved in pushing this exhibit, but also exhibits at the Bessemer Historical Society and public speakers around the state, and trying to create kind of a central network of community awareness around this. So there were a number of different layers that were going on. I think it's interesting what Don says about this idea of the Pueblo chieftain kind of feeling like, well, this is kind of a shameful story, and we don't really want to dwell on it. That gets at your question, Peggy, about interpreting controversy and presenting controversy in museums. We hear that all the time in Denver at the History Colorado Center. Why are you always telling negative stories? Why are you telling stories of the Sand Creek Massacre, of the Ku Klux Klan in Colorado? Why don't you only, why are you not interested in making people proud of being Coloradan? And I always think that's a funny reaction, because of course we tell really delightful stories of ski jumps and really good times in different ways. But those stories that are a little heavier tend to stick in people's minds when they come to museums, which, for a museum exhibitor, that's why stories like Ludlow are really good. They're stories that are sort of create emotional connections with the visitors. But also, museums are about authenticity, and as Don pointed out, we only tell one side of the story, and particularly if we avoid controversy, then we're not really doing our job. We're not representing the complexity of history.
And I want to follow up on what Bill just said, mentioning the statewide Commemoration Commission. One of the best ways we really connected with the larger audience around Ludlow was we had a very robust Facebook page, the Ludlow Centennial Commemoration Facebook page, and we were sharing things several times a day. People around the country, I mean, even around the world, were able to engage in the story. We found that there was a very rich connection in Greece to the Ludlow story, so we were making lots of Greek friends over this. We also heard from a number of Irish people who felt a connection to the story of Ludlow as well. And so Facebook really became a great way to share the story with the rest of the world.
And right along that line, with everyone having their story, you're both historians, and you're steep deep in Ludlow and what happened. Michelle Pearson, she has the question, what were some of the memorable interactions you had with the community members as you developed this exhibit? What was a surprise that you found out from, as you said, Don, that those other stories, those family stories, just when you think you know everything about Ludlow? What are some of the memorable interactions, some of the surprises you had in putting this exhibit together?
So one of the most controversial things that happened during the Ludlow Centennial was we had a woman named Linda from California who flew to Colorado for the commemoration. And she is a descendant of the Costa family. And 4 members of the Costa family died on April 20th at the Ludlow Tent Colony. And she came to an event where Scott Martell was speaking, and he is the author of Blood Passion, which is considered an essential text for the story of Ludlow. Well, she has a story that's very different than the recorded history, and in that Catalina Costa, a body had been desecrated at some point on April 20th. And there's no official documentation that supports this family story, but it is her family story passed down from eyewitness and then through the generations. And so Scott Martell's answer to her was, this never could have happened because I've seen the coroner's report and your story just isn't true. And so this launched a mini-day, followed up on the blogosphere controversy, again about this question, who has the right to remember? Mm-hmm. And I had not heard Linda's family story before about the desecration of Settelina's body. And there was no official documentation really to support her version of the story. But I think it's worth investigating. That was something very surprising to me. But I will say, in our exhibit, there is a section in the back of the exhibit where we call it a talkback board. And just 1 month ago, somebody who I don't know, who's not related to Linda in any way, wrote this story on an index card about the desecration of Settelina's body on April 20th. And so here, in a very unexpected way, we had somebody sharing the very same story that Linda had told us back in April from somebody not connected to her. And so that's very surprising. I don't know what to think about it. It certainly, I think, is worth some additional inquiry. But I think that was probably one of the most surprising and also became one of the most controversial parts of the entire commemoration.
And Bill, how about you? Were there parts of the exhibit that surprised you?
Oh, well, yeah. When Don and the exhibit team put together the memory workshops, they invited the Pueblo and Southern Colorado community to share their stories. And there were a number that were just amazing. The stories that people were passing down from the strike and Ludlow Massacre were so intensely personal, and you could tell that families had taken those stories and really woven them into their family identity for who they were. So there was an individual, and Don, you're going to have to remind me of his name. His grandfather was a striker, and he had a rifle that he wouldn't talk about other than to say that he used it at the strike, that it didn't gather dust at the strike. And he passed it to his grandson, and they were hunting, and his grandson needed a rifle, and so he gave him this lever-action Winchester rifle, the kind that you actually see in photographs of the strikers in the wake of the massacre when they retaliated over 10 days against the mining companies and the National Guard. The grandfather, the former striker, gave it to his grandson on the condition that he never give it away or loan it to anyone else. And you can imagine how badly we wanted to put that on display, but that a promise is a promise, and so ultimately we took a photograph of what. Don, can you remind me of his name?
Richard Bonaquista.
Yeah, Richard Bonaquista. Thank you. And we have a photograph in the exhibit of Richard holding his grandfather's rifle, and then the story is on a label. And those kinds of personal moments of people connecting over generations over this event really blew my mind when I read it.
Where you can sure tell the power of a story when it goes on generation to generation. Yeah. Let me ask a question from Bill Chapman. His question is, how about songs from the time?
Well, yeah, we don't have anything in the display necessarily about songs, although Don did include kind of a chant that kids did during Greek Easter as they're playing a game about Greek Easter eggs. Certainly the miners were singing, and boy, that would make a great audio component of an exhibit like this, to play some of the mining, some of the strike songs and the union songs and the songs that miners were constantly singing, the folk songs. They're just such a great cosmopolitan population of strikers. They're from dozens of different companies, from the Balkans and Greece, and from Russia and from Mexico and from the southern United States. All of these miners together with different languages who are trying to find a way to overcome their linguistic differences because they're all together for a common cause. And certainly song is one of the ways that they bridge the culture.
Yeah.
I want to add that one of our best commemoration events was a Ludlow concert. And it was all coal mining songs or labor songs that came, that were period the Ludlow story. And we had musicians from all over the state of Colorado at Memorial Hall in Pueblo on April 18th, 2 days before the anniversary date. And they sang songs from the coal mines, songs that the miners would have sang while on strike. And one of the most beautiful moments of this event was the entire audience, with the help of John McCutcheon, a folk singer, sang the Colorado Strike song. And the Colorado Strike song was very specific to the coalfield strike of 1913 and 14. And it was to the tune of Battle Cry of Freedom. And Frank J. Hayes, who was the United Mine Workers president, wrote new lyrics to go to this song. And one of the things we found is there was no recording that we could get our fingers on that put this song together in that way. So that night, in that moment, as a community, we sang this song together. It was recorded by our local paper. And then John McCutcheon, the folk singer, went to the Ludlow site the next morning and recorded a version of this song. And it's on YouTube now for people to listen to. And I think that's another beautiful commemoration moment, that we're finally able to hear this song that we read about in Tom Andrews' book, and we hear about in people's oral histories.
That's a great question, Bill Chapman, who bring in the power of music. I have a couple more questions for Don and Bill, and then we'll take some wrap-up questions. Don, you've done this already a little bit, but describe your work within your community in commemorating the event.
So like Bill had mentioned earlier, we have a statewide commemoration commission, and this was established by the governor in April of 2013. He established a commission, and there are 12 members from around the state who make up this commission. And it's a diverse group of people, including a representative from the United Mine Workers and a representative from the Colorado National Guard. Bill is on the commission, and I'm on the commission as well. And I am a co-chair of the commission and have been responsible for many of the community commemoration events. We've had a statewide lecture series in which we've brought scholars in on the subject of Ludlow, and we've arranged it so big cities can help fund it, so we can bring lectures down to Walsenburg or La Veta or Trinidad, small communities that don't have large pots of money, but still this is their story and need to have access to that kind of information. We've also done, as I mentioned, the Ludlow concert. We've done the memory writing workshops. One of the things I've just personally done is I've gone to every local labor group that I possibly could that would invite me and share the story of the exhibit to create that that kind of modern day connection to people who maybe are dealing with similar struggles. I've spoken to economic development groups, all sorts of along the spectrum of people. And then we have done a great Ludlow Symposium at our museum, which brought scholars from all over the country and Canada to discuss this very topic of Ludlow in new and intriguing ways. And so I feel like the commemoration has done a lot in an academic realm, but it's also done a lot in a more community realm. And it's interesting to bring, to kind of bridge those audiences together. I feel like the commemoration activities have done a great job of that. And the community has been very engaged. They've been very engaged with all of the commemoration activities and very engaged with our exhibit. As Bill mentioned, we had the memory writing workshops. And the people who participated in those workshops have a very special relationship to the Children of Ludlow exhibit. They often come and bring more people to see the exhibit because, they recognize that they were part of curating that exhibit with us. And so that's another way in which we've connected to the community.
And Bill, let me ask you, as a museum professional, what are the challenges of meeting the needs of diverse audiences?
Oh, wow, there are so many different ways I can answer that. Accessibility is a really important part of exhibits, and everything from making sure that that an exhibit is honoring the ADA requirements to the kind of readability and contrast we do, and the sort of the decisions we make about design to make sure that we have high contrast labels, that the labels are written at a certain grade school level, that we're telling stories that where audiences, the primary audiences, can see themselves in the exhibit. And I think one of the most important things that any exhibit project does is it has to start with the question of who is this exhibit for, who's the primary audience, and then go forward to meet the needs of that audience. In this case, this is the Children of Ludlow is intended for a very diverse audience, the audience of Pueblo and Southern Colorado, and so we were fortunate in that we had strong community buy-in to be able to tell the story that the community found authentic.
And then a last question, maybe between the two of you. What are the key things that should be remembered when teaching about this event? And how could teachers best use newspapers and primary sources to make this event come alive for their students?
Well, the key thing about Ludlow is that we live in a society where the connection between work and labor and the amenities that we take for granted. In 1913, that was coal fueled heat. In 2013, it's the clothing I'm wearing right now. That there are connections to labor that are invisible to us, and it's important for us to always to be mindful of the labor and the conditions of labor. The sacrifices that the strikers and their families made in 1913, led to mixed results in the short term. The strike was not entirely a success, but in the long term, Ludlow became a sort of an important propaganda point for organized labor. They could use what had happened at Ludlow to really draw national attention for a while to the conditions, the really horrible conditions of work that were going on in Southern Colorado, and it helped continue the national conversation that had been already before.
And I think what I would say to this question is this idea that in many ways we've often viewed the story of Ludlow through a very masculine lens. This is in many ways about workers and about, warriors. And so oftentimes when we think of that, we picture this very masculine lens. And I think Ludlow, we tried to demonstrate with the children of Ludlow. And oftentimes when you're talking about the children of Ludlow, you can't get away from the women that really were integral to the story. We've got women like Mary Petrucci, who was in the tent cellar, lost her children in that awful death chamber, but yet she emerged from that tent cellar and went on to keep fighting for the cause that they were fighting for at Ludlow. There's some very powerful stories that come from women within the larger story of this coalfield strike. And so I always urge people when they are discussing this or studying this to think about the ways that mothers and women, including great women like Mother Jones, but beyond icons like Mother Jones, to the women who were really there on the ground and oftentimes sacrificed, their families literally for this cause.
And so to get at the second part of your question, Peggy, about primary sources, there's really a great array of primary sources that are in the exhibit and that our researchers and exhibit developers use, including primary documents from United Mine Workers, who loaned us a register of heads of households in the tent. But you know, the official investigations of the massacre documented testimony from women and from children that isn't available anywhere else outside of the oral histories of their family. Certainly, there was an active press that covered the strike and the massacre. Although you know, anybody who uses that should be cautious about the political orientation of the press. You know, in the case of the Pueblo Chieftain in 1913, they were very pro owners and anti-labor. But then there were other socialist groups even like this. This is a cover of the Masses, which was a socialist newspaper, well, socialist magazine. And this is their Ludlow issue, right? This gets at your point, Don, about the warrior, right? Protecting the family. Where's the mom in that, right? It was also caught in the crossfire. But, you know, the press was more openly politicized than it is today. And so it's good to keep in mind what the political biases are of the sources you use.
I also want to point out that there's been, I think, a wonderful body of journalism that has happened this year on the story of Ludlow. I've seen articles that have talked to a number of descendants of Ludlow. I've seen articles that have uncovered new ways of viewing this topic. And so I think it's worth looking at articles that have been written this year in terms of a primary source for studying this story.
And in our last hangout, the Chronicling America, as well as the Denver Newspaper Agency and the Colorado Historic Newspapers. Anyway, that was definitely about the historical or the newspaper coverage at the time. I think you said, Don, about comparing today's coverage and that coverage, a great teaching point. I think, Bill, you actually addressed Dana's question. Let me just, if you have anything more to say. I know you had contact with the United Mine Workers of America before and during the establishment of the Children of Ludlow exhibit. Can you explain their role in the exhibit as well as the original 1914 event?
Yeah, I'd love to. We work with a terrific man. His name is Bob Butero. He's the regional chapter head of the United Mine Workers in Colorado, and he's one of the really terrific guys on the planet, in my opinion. And he, of course, is very interested in telling this story, and telling the story of labor and their contributions to the creation of America. And this is still a very symbolic moment in the history of organized labor and of the labor movement in general. The memorial down at the site is actually owned and maintained by the United Mine Workers. And Bob was extremely generous. He got us in contact with the national officers of the United Mine Workers and made primary resources available to us. As Don suggested, we also got a lot of input from the Colorado National Guard. There's a National Guard historian, a man named Adam Morgan, and Adam was also very interested in telling the story. Adam came at it from an interesting angle. I think he wanted to come charging into this defending the National Guard. It's difficult in the massacre to make the case that the National Guard was really acting in the public interest. They had kind of devolved into a mercenary force that was defending the interests of the owner. Adam is a member of an officer in the National Guard, and he's very proud of that, and rightly so. He wanted to come in and say that the National Guard really wasn't to blame. And as he investigated this, I think he began to realize that the National Guard's mission of protecting the defenseless was not honored at the Ludlow Massacre. But it was really fascinating in our first meetings for Adam and Bob to get together and kind of put aside differences and say, our job is to tell the truth, and we're going to find ways to tell this that will illuminate it and provide understanding and provide, as Don said, some of that complexity.
Well, I want to thank our presenters, Bill Convery and Don DePrince, and of course our audience. Thank you for joining us. And thank you on behalf of the Ludlow Educational Event Sponsors, Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources at Metropolitan State University of Denver, History Colorado, the Denver Post Newspapers and Education, and the TPS Teachers Network. We have one more Google Hangout on September 22nd, so please join us. Dr. Todd Logan and Dr. Matt Nakley from MSU Denver. As historians and educators, they'll discuss the Ludlow Massacre through the lens of the Progressive Era. If you missed our first Hangout with Dr. Thomas Andrews or our second Hangout about teaching with historic and current newspapers, they're well worth watching and available on YouTube. We still have room if you'd like to join us for a field experience to go on-site at the historic Ludlow Museum and visit the El Pueblo Museum in Pueblo on October 11th. Finally, as participants of this special professional development series, you'll gain access to a growing TPS Teachers Network, a private social media environment specifically for educators, and Library of Congress primary source enthusiasts just like you. Again, I want to thank our presenters, Bill and Don, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.